So how do you create a cult-like following? That kind of devotion that seems almost superhuman. Well, it turns out it's not magic. Not really. It's more like a science, a playbook that's been perfected over centuries. And today, we're going to tear that playbook open and look at the 5 key steps that have been used over and over again.
The groundwork for all of this was actually laid out hundreds of years ago by none other than Niccolo Machiavelli. He basically said, "A deceitful man will always find plenty who are ready to be deceived." What's he really saying? That there's this core human vulnerability, right? And it's been the bullseye for manipulators for, well, forever.
Okay, so that naturally leads to some pretty big questions, right? Like, why are we so open to being fooled in the first place? And maybe even more important, how exactly do people exploit that weakness?
So the source material we're looking at is pretty blunt about this. It basically says that we humans have this overwhelming, deep-seated need to believe in something. Apparently, we just can't handle doubt or, that feeling of emptiness for very long. So the moment some new cause or some miracle elixir comes along, we often just jump on it, which makes us, and I'm quoting here, eminently gullible.
And look, this gullibility, it's not something that's just taken advantage of by chance. Oh no. There's a whole system, a science of deception that's been tweaked and perfected over the years. We're going to call it the Charlatan's 5-step playbook.
Now, the word charlatan is key here, and the definition is really specific. Think of a charlatan as an operator who puts on this thin layer, this veneer of science. And listen to this, because this is the important part. They're not targeting the completely uneducated. No, they're targeting the semi-literate, people who know just enough to think they're smart, but have basically swapped their common sense for a bunch of distorted info.
All right, so here it is, the secret sauce, the 5 steps we're going to break down. Number 1, keep it vague and simple. Number 2, emphasize the visual and the sensual. 3, borrow the forms of religion. 4, disguise your income. And finally, number 5, create an us versus them dynamic. That's the blueprint right there.
Okay, so that's the theory, but how does this playbook actually work in the real world? Let's take a look at it in action with a couple of historical deep dives.
So first up, let's travel back to the 17th century and meet a guy named Francesco Borri. Now, Borri, he had a wild story. He claimed an archangel just appeared to him, chose him to lead a new papal army, and boom, suddenly he could see into people's souls and find the legendary Philosopher's Stone. I mean, talk about a grand romantic pitch, right?
And wouldn't you know it, his methods check off every box in the playbook. Let's break it down. Vague but super grand promises? Check. That's step 1. Creating a whole 6-degree hierarchy for his followers, just like in a religion? That's a classic step 3. Driving around in a jewel-studded coach to show everyone how successful he was? That is pure step 2, all about the visual spectacle. And when the church started coming after him, he used it as proof of his greatness. That is the classic us versus them of step 5. And of course, the big one, demanding his followers hand over every last penny. Textbook step 4. Yeah, this really just lays bare the genius and the deception of step 4, disguise your income. The illusion he's selling is, hey, look at all my wealth. It's proof my methods work. But what's the reality? Well, my wealth is coming directly from your pockets. He's promising this Philosopher's Stone will make everybody rich, someday. But the reality is that your assets get turned over to him right now. All right, on to our next case study. Another master of the craft, a guy named Michael Schupak, better known as the Mountain Doctor. Now, his angle wasn't angels and mystic visions. Nope, he built his entire cult around this romantic, super theatrical version of nature and simple, folksy cures. I mean, the showmanship here is just wow. It's next level. He was a master of step 1, right? Offering these beautifully simple solutions with names like the oil of joy. But his real genius, that was in step 2, creating this whole sensual theatrical experience. Get this, he would diagnose people just by looking at their urine from across the room. He'd use electric shocks to expel devils. He even staged this whole scene where a patient supposedly vomited a hay wagon, which, of course, he had hired to drive by at that exact moment. It was pure, unadulterated theater.
And it wasn't just him. Another one of these guys, James Graham, created something called a Temple of Health. Just listen to how this was described. Quote, "The windows were darkened, revealing a ceiling studded with electric stars and a young and lovely rosy goddess of health in a niche. It was ravishing and exalted the imagination to the highest degree." See? That is the very essence of step 2. You overwhelm the senses, you overwhelm the intellect with pure spectacle, and all that pesky skepticism just melts away.
Okay, so these stories might sound like they're from a completely different world, but the playbook itself, it's timeless. So that brings us to the most important question, really. How do you spot one of these charlatans today?
Because the source material nails it when it says, we find these latter-day charlatans in all arenas of life. Business, fashion, politics, art. We find them everywhere. In business, in fashion, in politics, in art, you name it. The stage might have changed from a wooden platform to a social media feed, but the psychological games, they are exactly the same.
This next line it sums the whole thing up perfectly. The methods don't change, only the names of the elixirs. So, that secret health cure from the 1700s, today it's a revolutionary business strategy. The philosopher's stone, now it's a can't-miss crypto coin. The underlying pattern, the DNA of the deception, it's identical.
So now that we know the playbook, now that we can see how it's still being used all around us, what's the big takeaway? What's the ultimate lesson here?
Well, the source leaves us with a pretty powerful and honestly a pretty sobering moral. It comes from a James Thurber fable called The Owl Who Was God, and the line is simply this: you can fool too many of the people too much of the time. So the real question isn't whether it works. The question is, now that you know the playbook, are you still going to be one of them?